Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the final early voting numbers, both including mail-in and in-person votes that have already been cast nationally. And so far, there's around 62 million votes that already have been cast early on, and more obviously will be happening on election day, November 5th. So as of right now, Democrats slightly have the advantage out registering Republicans just by 1 point, so it's practically a tie at 41% to the Republicans' 40%. And overall, 19% of the votes cast are from independent voters that can swing either way to Donald Trump's column or Kamala Harris. And I see people arguing that, some Republicans are voting for Kamala Harris. Well, guess what? The same thing goes for the other side. Some Democrats are voting for Donald Trump. So it really cancels out, I think, those claims I think that's bizarre to say that Donald Trump will lose because Republicans are voting for Harris. Well, guess what? The same thing's happening. Democrats are also voting for Donald Trump. So I think those cancel out, and I think both, views are correct. So before we get started with the early voting percentages in every single swing state and competitive ones, including Oregon, because surprisingly, it's actually, I believe, within single digits as of right now. So we're also going to be taking a look at that. Make sure you guys are subscribed, click the bell so you don't miss on my content, press the like button, share this video. Don't forget, we have memberships. You can find a link to that in the description section if you are interested. So we take a look at the gender gap right here. Women out-register men in terms of the ballots that have already been cast. 54% of voters are women to the 44% that are men. And there's a small, unknown percentage in this. But let's take a look at the states and let's fill them out. So Oregon, as of right now, Democrats lead the early vote in terms of registration, not the actual votes themselves. As we all know, some Democrats will be voting for Trump and some Republicans will be voting for Kamala Harris by just 7%. The Democrats are at 40% to the Republicans 33%, and roughly 27% of that is coming from independent voters. So that's where we're at with Oregon. It's just a likely margin lead for Kamala Harris in terms of the early vote. Now we take a look at the Sunbelt state of Arizona. This is a border state, very important. As we all know, the most accurate pollster, Atlas Intel, from the 2020 election was the number one most accurate out of any. Their final poll from Arizona is Donald Trump plus 4%. And as of right now, in terms of the early vote, he's up by even more than that. So far, 1,720,000 mail-in and early in-person votes have been cast in the state of Arizona. Plenty more will come in by election day, November 5th. Republicans are out registering Democrats with the early vote, 42% to the Democrats, 34%. And this is horrible if you're a Democrat, because typically you're supposed to lead in terms of the early vote, no matter which state it is. Even in Arizona in 2020, Democrats led in the early vote. Now it's the complete opposite, and the difference is 8%, and there are roughly 24 independents that have cast their ballot already. So Arizona at this point in time is likely for Donald Trump with the early vote. And then you have the state of Nevada, which as of right now, Republicans also lead, or Donald Trump, in terms of registration, the GOP leads in Nevada's early vote, but only 887,000 votes have been cast. 39% for the GOP. Democrats trail by 4 at 35%. And independents are at 26% in terms of the registration. So as of right now, Nevada is looking like it's lean for the former president with the early vote. We take a look at the gender gap in the state of Nevada. Women actually trail men by just 1%. That's the difference, 44 to 45, with 11% unknown. And this is the map so far. We move on to Colorado, in which the early vote in this state is not looking good for Democrats. They only lead Republicans by just 2%. But there's a large independent vote share, which could break heavily for the Democrats, which is why it will go to Kamala more by probably 2 points on election day. The Democrats are at 30% to the Republicans in terms of registration by 28%. But yet again, that's a large independent vote. And so far, 1,383,000 mail-in and early in-person votes have been cast already. Take a look at the gender gap in the state of Colorado. Women lead men by 4%, 52 to 48. So as of right now, Democrats are leading barely in terms of the early vote in the state of Colorado by just 2% And now moving on to the state of New Mexico, which is really interesting because it's a border state, and Trump just had a rally yesterday in Albuquerque, which maybe that can make the state a whole lot closer. But as of right now, Democrats are leading Republicans at 48% to 37%, and there hasn't been that many votes cast, just 455,000. That's not at all, a big number. And there's 15% of this vote share that are independent voters. You take a look at the gender gap, 54 to 46. Women lead, no surprise here. So as of right now, it's likely for the Democrats. So in terms of the early vote, New Mexico is actually voting to the left of Colorado, which I expect that to change. On election day, I expect it to flip because number one, Colorado has a large independent vote share greater than New Mexico, and also Colorado is just in general just bluer than New Mexico. And now we take a look at the state of Texas, which Republicans are doing tremendous in terms of the early voting numbers in this state. So far, 7,515,000 mail-in and early in-person votes have been cast in the state of Texas. 37% are registered Democrats. Republicans are leading at 51%, with 12% are independent voters. And now we take a look at the gender gap in this state. 54% to 46%. Women lead that as well. And women are supposed to break heavily for Democrats. I actually expect Kamala to do better among women voters than Joe Biden. But that's not necessarily the case. But, I mean, in terms of that, then if you look at that alone, then yes, Kamala is doing good. But if you take a look at the numbers in terms of party registration, that actually favors Donald Trump. So it really varies on what you take a look at. So this will be solid, or actually likely, for Donald Trump. And then we move on to the state of Florida, which as of right now, Republicans lead the early vote at 44 to 34%. That's a 10% difference, which will be likely for Donald Trump. He is leading the early vote and also leading in Miami-Dade County in terms of party registration. Yet again, not every Republican is going to vote for Donald Trump, and the same thing goes for Kamala Harris. Not every Democrat's going to vote for her, and this is just party registration, not who they actually voted for. And 22% of this vote share is coming in from independent voters. So far, 6,225,000 mail-in and early in-person votes have been cast. You take a look at the gender gap in the state of Florida's early vote. Women lead yet again, just like in most states, 55 to 45%, which is supposed to be good for Kamala. But even though women are leading, guess what? You take a look at the party registration, Republicans are leading by 10 percentage points. That can mean one or two things. Women are doing better for Donald Trump than in recent years past, or that Republican women are actually breaking heavily for Kamala Harris. We'll see what it's going to look like on election day. And then you have the state of Georgia, which Republicans are doing tremendous in terms of the early vote. So far, 3,608,000 votes have been cast already, and the Republicans are up by 3%. In 2020, Democrats led the early vote by a tremendous amount, and now it is the exact opposite. It flipped. Democrats are just at 45% to 48%. You take a look at the gender gap. Yet again, women lead 56 to 44. So Georgia is lean for Donald Trump in terms of the early voting numbers, party registration. And then you have North Carolina, which Donald Trump, or Republicans, also lead by 1%, 34 to 33%. And so far, 3,622,000 votes have been cast, with a large independent number at 33% of registries are independent voters. So this will be tilt for the Republicans in terms of registration. Yet again, we don't know who they're actually voting for. You have the state of Virginia, which Glenn Youngkin is working so hard. And by the way, the Supreme Court just sided with Glenn Youngkin's argument, and they allow the state of Virginia to take off voters that should not be voting, aka non-citizens. So in terms of the Virginia early vote, Democrats are leading by just about 11%. The difference is 50 to 39%, with 11% of those votes share are independent voters. So you have 1,890,000 votes cast already in the state of Virginia. So you take a look at the gender gap. Yet again, 56 to 44. It's very consistent. The numbers throughout these swing states are very similar. It's either 55 to 45 or 56 to 44. Women lead the early voting numbers. So as of right now, Virginia is likely in terms of the early vote for Kamala Harris. And none of this should be shocking. The only shocking thing or surprising thing about this is Republicans leading the early vote in Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and Nevada. That's really looking good for Donald Trump. And on election day, it's supposed to get even better for Republicans. So Democrats, as of right now, it's not looking too good for you. Alan Lichtman, you predicting Kamala Harris is not looking good for you. And now we move on to the state of Ohio, in which, as of right now, Republicans lead the early vote by 9% at 50 to 49%. You take a look at the gender gap, it's 51 to 43% women lead. So as of right now, Ohio, in terms of the early vote, is likely for the former president. You take a look at the state of Iowa. I think this is pretty comfortable for Donald Trump. And Democrats actually lead the early vote by 2 percentage points. So that's going to be a lean margin with a large independent vote share at 20%. You take a look at the gender gap, 55 to 45 women, which should break good for Kamala Harris. So, Iowa going to Harris with the early vote is not a surprise to anyone. It should not be. I mean, this is normal stuff. Democrats do better with the early vote, and Republicans usually, fill in the gap, or basically, Democrats have a firewall, especially in some of these Rust Belt states, which Republicans, if they can close the gap between the firewall, then that means if they can get high enough turnout on election day, then they can very well win those states, which is what I'm trying to say. And then you have the state of Minnesota, looking good for, I wouldn't say it's looking good for Democrats, but I mean, it's like average for Republicans. No surprise here. This should not be shocking. Democrats lead the early vote in Minnesota 43 to 20%. That's a difference of exactly 23 points, with a large independent vote share of 37%. Voters whom are independent, 51 to 43 with the age gap. Women, no surprise here. So Minnesota is safe with the early vote. This should not be a shocker to anyone. You have the state of Wisconsin, a very important state, and Democrats are leading Republicans with the early vote, but they're actually trailing to independents. So independents actually lead party registration in the state of Wisconsin. 41% vote of the voters are independent. 35 Democrats and 24% Republicans. So as of right now, Democrats are leading the early vote in Wisconsin by a likely margin. And you take a look at the gender gap in this state, 51 to 43 women. Yet again, it's very consistent numbers, very similar throughout these battleground states. You have Michigan. Democrats also lead by just 5 points. Republicans are closing the gap in this state and are ready to take the lead on election day in the state of Michigan. If you're Kamala Harris, these are disastrous numbers for you. 2,407,000 votes have been cast already, and the early vote lead for Kamala is just 5%. That's only a lean to likely margin? That is not good news for the vice president. And the gender gap in the state is 55 to 45. Basically the same thing throughout all these states, so let's not take a look at the gender gap. I think we take a look at that enough already. You have Pennsylvania, in which Democrats are leading by a substantial number, but Republicans yet again are closing the gap, and every single day they basically outnumber Democrats in terms of ballots requested, and 58 to 32% Democrats. So not really shocking. They always lead the early vote. Donald Trump should be able to close the gap. 1,625,000 votes have been cast in the state of Pennsylvania. So obviously it's solid blue in terms of the early vote. Not surprising at all. And the last and final state to take a look at the early vote is New Hampshire, which as of right now, Democrats are leading the registration by just around 5 percentage points. And 29% of these voters are independent voters. So this is going to be considered a lean margin for the vice president. And if you want to take a look at the age gap instead of the gender, which is what we looked at the entire video. So here's the age gap. 44% of voters are 65 years or older, just 27% are 50 to 64 years old, and just 12% are 40 to 49 years old. So the older it gets, the higher the number is. 9% of voters are 30 to 39, and then you have Gen Z obviously at just 8%. So that's pretty much it. This is the finalized map in terms of the final early voting results. These are the real numbers, real votes, and we expect Republicans to do tremendously better, even though they already are, on Election Day, November 5th. So if the election was based on the early voting numbers only, Kamala Harris gets 276 electoral votes to 262 for Donald Trump. A very weird looking map. Probably not going to happen. That's pretty much it. One last fine reminder is to subscribe, click the bell so you don't miss out my content, press the like button, share this video. If you're interested, we have memberships. You can find links to that in the description section. Thank you everyone for watching.